The voice that wasn't Danny. The last person to hear Danny Mercer's voice before he vanished forever was me. I have carried that weight for 30 years now, turning it over in my mind like a stone worn smooth by endless handling. Every word he said to me that final night, every warning he tried to give me, every moment I failed to understand what was really happening until it was far too late. His voice lives in my memory the way ghosts are said to live in old houses, present but untouchable, real but impossible to hold on to, no matter how desperately you reach. My name is Marcus Webb. This is the story of what happened in the summer of 1994 in a remote section of the Cascade Range in Oregon, in a place where the forest itself seemed to learn how to speak with human tongues. I am telling this story now because Danny Mercer deserves to be remembered by someone other than the files gathering dust in some government archive. Because the truth deserves to be spoken aloud even when no one wants to hear it. And because somewhere out there right now, someone else might be sitting alone in a fire tower, just like I was listening to a voice on the radio that sounds exactly like someone they trust, not knowing that the person they think they are talking to might already be gone. I was 23 years old that summer, finishing my final year at the University of Oregon, with a degree in environmental science and absolutely no clear plan for what would come after graduation. My professors talked endlessly about career paths and job markets and the importance of networking, handing out pamphlets about graduate programs and entry-level positions at consulting firms. None of it felt real to me. None of it mattered. What felt real was the weight of a backpack on my shoulders as I climbed a mountain trail at dawn. What mattered was the smell of pine needles crushed underfoot, the vast silence of a forest that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single human sound to break its ancient peace. I had a job I loved, a job I'd been doing every summer since I turned 19 years old. Fire lookout for the United States Forest Service, manning remote observation towers scattered throughout the wilderness, watching for smoke on the horizon, and recording weather data, and spending long weeks alone with nothing but trees and sky and my own thoughts for company. It was the kind of work that most people simply could not handle. The silence got to them first, that profound absence of human noise that city people found unsettling in ways they could not articulate. Then came the boredom, the slow realization that days out here were not filled with adventure and excitement, but with routine and repetition, and hours that stretched like taffy in the summer heat. And finally, for those who lasted long enough, came the creeping sense that the world had forgotten they existed entirely, that they could vanish from their towers one night, and no one would notice until the supply truck came around again in 2 weeks. I had seen it happen to other seasonal workers over the years. Watched them start talking to themselves, carrying on elaborate conversations with imaginary companions just to hear the sound of another voice. Watched them jump at shadows and peer into the darkness with wide, frightened eyes, convinced that something was watching them back. Watch them simply walk off the job one day without a word of explanation, hiking down the mountain and never returning, leaving behind half-eaten meals and unmade beds and radio logs that ended mid-sentence. The isolation did something to people. It reached inside them and found the cracks. They did not know they had hairline fractures in their psyches, that the noise and distraction of normal life kept hidden, and it pried those cracks open with patient, relentless pressure until something fundamental broke. But I was different. I had always been different ever since I was a child, who preferred the company of books to the chaos of the playground, who spent summer afternoons alone in the woods behind my parents' house instead of playing baseball with the neighborhood kids. Where others found loneliness and solitude, I found peace. Where they heard oppressive silence, I heard a symphony of natural sounds that never played the same arrangement twice, wind through pine needles and birds calling across valleys, and the distant rumble of thunder that might mean rain or might mean fire. I thrived in isolation the way some people thrive in crowds, drawing energy from the emptiness Instead of being drained by it, finding clarity in the absence of human demands and expectations, and the constant low-level anxiety of social interaction. My mother used to worry about me when I was younger. She would ask why I did not have more friends, why I turned down invitations to parties and dances, why I seemed happier alone in my room than surrounded by my peers. I never had a good answer for her, at least not one that made sense in words. Some people are just built for quiet places, I suppose. Some people find their truest selves not in the reflection of other people's eyes, but in the mirror of their own solitude. That summer of 1994 was my 9th season with the Forest Service. 9 years of climbing rickety wooden stairs to cabins perched on mountainsides, of watching thunderstorms roll across valleys like slow-motion explosions of light and sound, of falling asleep to the whisper of wind in the pines, and waking to sunrises that painted the sky in colors I had no adequate names for. I thought I knew everything there was to know about these mountains by then. I thought I had seen everything the wilderness could possibly show me, every mood and face it could wear. I thought I understood the forest the way you understand an old friend, with the comfortable familiarity that comes from years of shared experience. I thought I was safe out here, protected by my knowledge and my experience and my deep abiding love for this place that had become more home to me than any building with walls and a roof. I was wrong about all of it. So completely and catastrophically wrong that I sometimes wonder if I ever really understood anything at all. The tower they assigned me that summer was called Lookout 7, a weathered wooden structure perched on a rocky outcrop in the western section of the Cascade Range. It was older than most of the other stations I had worked over the years, built sometime in the early 1940s. By workers whose names had long since been forgotten, constructed from timber cut from the very forest it was meant to protect. The years had not been kind to it. The wood had turned gray with decades of exposure to sun and rain and snow. The rich brown of fresh-cut lumber faded to the color of old bones. There were places where you could see daylight through gaps in the siding that no amount of patching and caulking seemed to permanently fix, thin, bright lines that appeared and disappeared as the wood expanded and contracted with the seasons. The windows were old single-pane glass that rattled in their frames when the wind picked up, some of them cracked and repaired with tape that had yellowed with age. The whole structure creaked and groaned like a living thing, swaying slightly in strong gusts, a gentle rocking motion that took some getting used to, but eventually became almost comforting, like being cradled in some vast, gentle hand. The cabin itself was small, maybe 15 feet on each side, containing everything I would need to survive for weeks at a time with minimal resupply. A narrow cot pushed against the west wall, its mattress thin and lumpy but serviceable enough after you learned to avoid the springs that poked through in certain spots. A propane stove in the corner for cooking and heating, the kind of ancient appliance that looked like it might explode at any moment but had probably been running reliably since before I was born. A wooden desk beneath the east-facing window, scarred with the initials and idle carvings of generations of lookouts before me, holding my radio equipment and the logbooks where I would record weather data and fire sightings in the same format rangers had been using for 50 years. A small pantry shelf stocked with canned goods and dried food. A bucket for water hauled up from the spring 200 yards down the slope. A chemical toilet in a closet that I tried to use as infrequently as possible. The window surrounded me on all four sides, floor to ceiling, giving me an unobstructed 360-degree view of the forest that rolled away in every direction like a frozen green ocean. On clear days, I could see for 50 miles or more, could watch hawks and eagles circling on thermal currents. So far away, they looked like specks of dust against the endless blue. The beauty of it never got old, not in 9 years, not in 900. Every sunrise was different. Every sunset was a new painting. Every storm that rolled through was a reminder of how small and temporary human beings were compared to the vast, patient forces of nature. The nearest road was 10 miles to the east, a rutted and overgrown logging track that was barely passable even in good weather. The nearest town was 30 miles beyond that, a handful of buildings clustered around a gas station that catered to the occasional tourist or hunter who wandered through on their way to somewhere else. And the ranger station at the base of my mountain, where supply trucks came every 2 weeks and emergency calls were coordinated, was 4 miles away down a winding trail through some of the densest old-growth forest I had ever encountered, trees so tall and thick that they turned afternoon sunlight into perpetual green twilight. I arrived at Lookout 7 on the first day of June, hiking in with a pack that weighed nearly 60 pounds and a heart that felt lighter than it had in months. The academic year always weighed on me, the pressure of classes and deadlines and the constant low-grade social anxiety of campus life. But out here, all of that fell away. Out here I could breathe, I could think, I could be exactly who I was without apology or explanation. The trail climbed steadily through stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar trees that had been growing since before the first European explorers set foot on this continent. Their trunks were wider than I was tall, their lowest branches starting 40 or 50 feet above my head, their crowns lost somewhere in the hazy green distance above. The forest floor was soft with centuries of accumulated needles, and the air smelled like something ancient and clean, like the world had smelled before humanity came along to complicate it. I stopped several times to rest, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to absorb the beauty around me, to let it soak into my skin and bones and remind me why I kept coming back to this place year after year. By late afternoon, I could see the tower through gaps in the canopy above its gray wooden walls, blending almost perfectly with the rocky outcrop it sat upon. From below, it looked like something that had grown there naturally, an extension of the mountain itself, rather than something built by human hands. The final approach was steep, a series of switchbacks carved into the slope by generations of rangers' feet, and by the time I reached the top, I was breathing hard and sweating through my shirt despite the cool mountain air. But I was home. For the next 3 months, this would be my home. And despite everything that would happen, despite the horrors that awaited me in the weeks ahead, I cannot describe the peace I felt in that moment. Standing on the deck of Lookout 7 for the first time, looking out at the vast wilderness spreading away beneath me, listening to the wind whisper through the pines, I felt like I had finally arrived at the place I was always meant to be. The first few weeks passed the way first weeks always did when starting a new assignment. I settled into the rhythm of the job, learning the particular quirks of this tower and this section of forest, establishing the routines that would carry me through the summer months ahead. Wake at dawn with golden light streaming through the eastern windows, the forest below still wrapped in gray mist that would burn off within an hour or two. Coffee on the propane stove, strong and black and bitter drunk, standing at the window watching that mist rise and dissipate like ghosts fleeing the morning sun. Weather readings at 7 noon and 6 temperature and humidity and wind speed and direction, recorded in the logbook with careful precision, the same measurements taken at the same times by rangers and towers all across the mountains. Horizon scans every hour, binoculars pressed to my eyes until my vision swam, searching for any wisp of smoke that might indicate a fire starting somewhere in the vast green expanse. Most of the time there was nothing, just endless trees and distant peaks and the occasional hawk drifting on thermal currents. But every now and then I would spot something, a thin gray column rising from a ridge miles away, and I would radio it in and feel a small surge of pride knowing that I might have just prevented a disaster. That was the job in the end. Watching and waiting and being ready to sound the alarm when the moment came. Radio checks with the ranger station 3 times a day, quick exchanges of information that rarely lasted more than a few minutes. The day shift rangers were friendly enough but perpetually busy, their attention divided among dozens of tasks and responsibilities that had nothing to do with a lookout sitting alone on a distant peak. They did not have time for long conversations, and honestly, I did not need them. What I needed was what I had always needed: the silence and the solitude and the slow passage of hours marked only by the movement of shadows across my floor and the changing angle of sunlight through my windows. But every evening, as the sun sank toward the western peaks and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, as the shadows stretched long across the valley below, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening east, I would sit down at my radio and wait for a different kind of voice to come through the speaker, a voice that belonged to the night shift ranger at the station below, a voice that would become, over the weeks that followed, the closest thing to a friend I had ever found in these mountains: Danny Mercer. He was a stranger to me at first, nothing more than a name on the duty roster and a voice in the static. I had never met him in person, which was not unusual given how remote my assignment was and how little reason there was for a lookout and a station ranger to cross paths physically. In 9 years of working for the Forest Service and all the dozens of rangers and lookouts and administrators and support staff I had encountered at trainings and meetings and the occasional social gathering, our paths had somehow never intersected in the physical world. He was just a voice to me, a presence made of radio waves and electricity, someone who existed only in the space between my transmission and his response. But voices can be powerful things. Voices can create connections that faces and bodies cannot. There is an intimacy to conversation without sight, a way of knowing someone through their words alone that is different from and sometimes deeper than the knowing that comes from sharing physical space. When you talk to someone night after night with nothing but darkness and static between you, when you share your thoughts and fears and memories with no visual cues to guide or mislead you, something happens. Something builds. You start to feel like you know them in a way you might never know someone you saw every day. Danny was 27 years old, 4 years my senior. He had grown up in a small timber town called Oak Ridge, about 60 miles to the south, one of those communities that had been built around the logging industry and had been slowly dying ever since the mills started closing in the 70s and 80s. He told me about his childhood there during our long evening conversations, painting pictures with words of a place I had never been, but could see clearly in my mind's eye. The creek behind his parents' house where he caught crawfish in the summer, the cold, clear water numbing his hands as he reached under rocks to find them. The hills above town where he hunted deer with his father every autumn, learning patience and silence and the art of being still. The smell of sawdust that hung over everything in those days, drifting down from the mill that ran 3 shifts and employed half the men in town, a smell that had faded over the years as the mill cut back production and then finally closed entirely. He had joined the Forest Service right out of high school, desperate to escape a place that felt like it was dying around him. 17 years old, with nothing but a diploma and a willingness to work, he had started at the bottom of the ladder, clearing trails and hauling supplies up to remote stations like mine. Over the years, he had worked his way up to his current position, the night shift ranger responsible for monitoring radio communications and coordinating emergency responses while the rest of the station slept. It was solitary work, not unlike mine, and he had chosen it for the same reasons I had chosen mine. He loved the mountains the way I did. That was what first drew us together, that shared devotion to this place that did not require explanation or justification. He understood why someone would choose to spend months alone in the wilderness when they could be somewhere else, surrounded by other people and all the comforts and complications of modern life. He understood because he had made the same choice. We were both refugees from a world that felt too loud and too fast and too demanding, and we had both found sanctuary in the same vast, quiet place. We talked about everything that summer, Danny and I, books we had read and books we wanted to read, dog-eared paperbacks passed back and forth through supply runs, stories that seemed to mean more when discussed in the darkness between mountain peaks. Places we dreamed of visiting someday, national parks and foreign countries and cities we had only seen in photographs. Plans that always seemed to begin with, when I save up enough money or when I finally have time. Memories from childhood that still felt vivid despite the years, moments that had shaped us into the people we had become. We talked about our families, the ones we had been born into, and the ones we hoped to someday build. We talked about regrets and hopes and fears, the big philosophical questions that seemed to matter more out here than they did in the noise and distraction of ordinary life. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all, just comfortable silence punctuated by occasional observations, the presence of another consciousness at the other end of the frequency, enough to make the darkness feel less absolute. I would tell him about the sunset I was watching, the way the light was catching the clouds, and he would make some small sound of acknowledgement that told me he was still there, still listening. He would describe the way the stars looked from the station clearing, and I would close my eyes and try to see them through his words. It was a strange kind of intimacy, but it was real. It was the most real friendship I had ever had. Danny had a voice I can still hear perfectly when I close my eyes, even now, 30 years later. Low and slightly rough, like gravel being tumbled smooth in a stream, but with warmth underneath that roughness that made you want to keep listening. He laughed easily, a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and made the radio speaker vibrate slightly. He called me kid despite our minimal age difference, a term of endearment rather than condescension. He gave advice I never asked for and listened to problems I did not even know I had until I heard myself speaking them aloud. I trusted him. I trusted him completely, the way you trust the ground beneath your feet or the air in your lungs without consciously thinking about it, because the alternative was simply too strange to contemplate. He was my connection to the world beyond my tower, my anchor in the vast sea of solitude. Every evening, no matter how long or lonely the day had been, I knew that sunset would bring his voice through my radio, and that knowledge made everything else bearable. That trust would prove to be dangerous. That trust would nearly get me killed. But I am getting ahead of myself. The first sign that something was wrong came in the 6th week of summer. It was a Thursday evening, the sky turning shades of orange and purple so vivid they almost hurt to look at. I had just finished my 6 o'clock weather readings and was settling into my chair by the radio, waiting for Danny's voice to come through the speaker at its usual time. The day had been quiet, uneventful, just another link in the long chain of identical days that made up a summer in the lookout tower. I had seen a hawk catch something small in the meadow far below, had watched a family of deer picking their way along a distant ridge, had read 100 pages of a novel that was already fading from my memory. The radio crackled to life at 7:15, right on schedule. But something was different about Danny's voice that night. Tighter, more careful. Like he was weighing each word on some internal scale before letting it leave his mouth. "Hey, Marcus, quick question for you." "Go ahead." "You seen anyone hiking through your section lately? Any campers, hunters, anything like that?" I thought about it for a moment, running back through the past weeks in my memory. The trails around Lookout 7 were rarely used, too remote and steep for casual hikers too far from established campgrounds to attract the weekend warriors with their expensive gear and REI memberships. In 6 weeks, the only human being I had seen was the supply truck driver who came every 2 weeks with food and fuel and occasionally mail. "Negative," I said. "Why do you ask?" A pause. The static seemed louder than usual, filling the silence between us with white noise that felt almost deliberate. "Found some tracks near the station this morning, boot prints. Fresh ones from the look of them. Figured it was probably just some poachers scouting the area." "Did you report it?" "Yeah, filed it with the day crew. They said they would send someone to check it out tomorrow." Another pause, longer this time. "It is probably nothing. Just seemed weird, you know, we do not get many visitors out here." I told him not to worry about it. Probably hunters, like he said. Maybe some hikers who had wandered off the main trails and gotten themselves turned around. Nothing to be concerned about. The forests were vast and largely empty, but that did not mean no one ever passed through. People appeared in unexpected places sometimes. That was just the nature of wilderness. Danny laughed, but the sound was hollow forced. Yeah, you're probably right. Been out here too long, that is all. Starting to see things that are not there. We talked for another hour after that, our usual meandering conversation about nothing in particular. But I could hear something underneath his words the whole time, a tension that had not been there in our previous conversations. A weight pressing down on every syllable, distorting them in subtle ways that I could perceive but not quite identify. That night after we signed off and I lay in my cot waiting for sleep to come, I heard something outside my window, a sound that did not fit the usual symphony of forest noises I had grown so accustomed to over the years, something that made me freeze with my hand halfway to the lantern on my nightstand. Footsteps, soft and careful but unmistakably human footsteps on the packed earth around the base of my tower. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to hear over the thunder of my own heartbeat. The sound came again, closer now, circling around toward the wooden stairs that led up to my cabin. Then it stopped. Just stopped suddenly and completely, as if whatever was making it had sensed my attention and decided to wait. I do not know how long I lay there in the darkness, paralyzed between the urge to investigate and the instinct to remain hidden. Eventually I gathered enough courage to grab my flashlight and go to the window, clicking it on and shining the beam out into the night. Nothing. Just shadows and moonlight and the faint rustle of wind through the pine branches. The clearing around my tower was empty exactly as it should have been, exactly as it always was. Probably just a deer, I told myself as I climbed back into bed, or a raccoon checking for garbage, or a bear passing through on its way to somewhere else. Animals came close to the tower all the time. I had found their tracks in the soft earth hundreds of times over the years, proof of nocturnal visits I had slept right through. There was nothing unusual about hearing something moving around outside at night. Nothing to worry about. Nothing at all. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for a sleep that refused to come, I could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that the comfortable isolation I had always loved had somehow transformed into something else, something that watched, something that waited, something that had noticed me for the first time and was deciding what to do about it. I did not tell Danny about what I had heard. I am not entirely sure why. Maybe I was embarrassed by my own fear, did not want him to think I was the kind of person who jumped at shadows after 9 years in the wilderness. Maybe I was hoping that if I did not speak about it aloud, it would not be real. Maybe I sensed on some level that I could not articulate that speaking the words would make them true in a way that could not be undone. Whatever the reason, I kept quiet. And the summer continued day following day in its usual rhythm, while the small, strange moments began to pile up like thunderclouds on the horizon. The 7th week brought changes I did not understand and could not explain away, no matter how hard I tried. Danny spoke less during our nightly conversations. Where before we might talk for 2 or 3 hours now, our exchanges were shorter, more clipped. He would answer my questions with single words, would trail off in the middle of sentences, as if distracted by something I could not see or hear. Sometimes he would go completely silent for long stretches, and I would have to call his name 3 or 4 times before he responded, always with an apology that sounded increasingly rehearsed. Sorry, kid, just tired. Long day. But it was more than tiredness. I could hear it in his voice, that same tension I had noticed the night he asked about the boot prints. It had not faded with time. If anything, it had grown stronger, sharpening into something that sounded almost like fear. And then there were the things he said late at night when the darkness pressed close around both of us, and the silence between our words seemed to take on weight and substance of its own. Marcus, Do you ever feel like someone is watching you out here? The question came out of nowhere, interrupting a conversation about something completely mundane. I felt my skin prickle at the words, remembering the footsteps I'd heard outside my window, the feeling of being observed that I had been trying so hard to dismiss. Sometimes, I admitted, it is just the forest. It plays tricks on you. Yeah, the forest. A long pause. What if it was not the forest, though? What if there really was someone out there, someone watching us? Then we would report it and let the day crew handle it. That is what they are for. Right, right. Well, his voice sounded far away, like he was talking more to himself than to me. What if the day crew could not handle it? What if nobody could? I did not know what to say to that. The question felt too big, too strange, like a door opening onto a room I did not want to enter. So I said nothing, and eventually Danny changed the subject, and we talked about something else, until my eyelids grew heavy and I signed off for the night. But his words stayed with me, echoing in the darkness of my cabin. What if nobody could handle it? What did that even mean? What could possibly be out here in these forests, in this place I thought I knew so well that trained rangers could not deal with 3 nights later? I woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of my radio crackling to life. This was not unusual by itself. Sometimes Danny called late if there was an emergency of some kind, a fire spotted in some distant section, or a hiker reported overdue from a day trip. I was used to being pulled from sleep by that familiar sound, the hiss and pop of static resolving into human speech. But when I stumbled to the desk and grabbed the receiver, my mind still foggy with interrupted dreams, there was no voice on the other end, just static. And underneath the static, something else entirely. Breathing, slow, rhythmic, heavy, like someone holding down the transmit button and breathing directly into the microphone. In and out, mechanical and deliberate. "Danny," I said, "is that you?" No response, just the breathing. In and out, in and out. "Danny, if this is some kind of joke, it is not funny. What is going on?" The breathing continued for a few more seconds, unchanged, unresponsive. Then the radio clicked off. Silence rushed in to fill the void. I tried calling back. Once, twice, 3 times, my finger jabbing the transmit button with increasing urgency. Nothing but dead air. I sat at my desk for nearly an hour after that, waiting for the radio to crackle again, waiting for Danny's voice to come through with some kind of explanation. But the silence remained unbroken, and eventually exhaustion overcame anxiety, and I went back to bed. The next evening I asked Danny about it. Late night call. He sounded genuinely confused. No, I was asleep well before midnight. Everything was quiet. No incidents, no transmissions. But the radio turned on. I heard someone breathing. A pause. When Danny spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral, as if he was consciously controlling his reaction. Must have been interference. These old radios pick up all kinds of weird signals sometimes. Truckers, ham radio operators, who knows what else bouncing around the atmosphere. It happens. It did not sound like interference. Danny laughed, but there was no humor in it, no warmth. "You're spending too much time alone up there, kid. Your brain is starting to make things up to keep itself entertained. Trust me, I've been there. Just ignore it and try to get some sleep." I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe it was just interference, just my isolation playing tricks on my mind, just the natural result of too many weeks alone with nothing but my own thoughts for company. But something in his voice told me he did not believe what he was saying any more than I did. Something told me he was just as scared as I was and trying not to show it. That night after we signed off and I prepared for bed, I walked to my window and looked out at the forest below. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the clearing around my tower. Silver light spilled over everything, turning the familiar landscape into something strange and beautiful and slightly unreal. I could see the trail leading down from my stairs, could see the tree line about 50 yards away, could see the darkness pooling between the trunks where the moonlight could not reach. And at the edge of that clearing, right where the trees began, I saw something that made my blood run cold in my veins. Footprints, fresh boot prints in the soft earth, circling my tower in a wide arc, coming close to the base of the stairs, stopping there for what must have been some time, judging by how deep they were pressed, then retreating back toward the forest and vanishing into the darkness between the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself that they had been there before, that I had somehow overlooked them during the day, that they were nothing to worry about. But I checked the ground around my tower every morning as part of my routine, looking for animal tracks and signs of erosion and anything else that might need reporting. Those prints had not been there at sunrise. They had not been there at sunset when I came in from my final scan of the horizon. They had been made during the night, while I slept. Someone had been here. Someone had circled my tower in the darkness, had approached my stairs, had stood there for God knows how long, looking up at my windows, close enough to hear me breathing on the other side of the thin wooden walls. And I had not heard a single thing. The next morning I radioed Danny and told him everything. The footsteps I had heard weeks ago that I had dismissed as animals, the breathing on the radio, the boot prints I had found fresh in the earth around my tower. The words tumbled out of me like water from a burst dam, days and weeks of suppressed fear finally finding release. Danny listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence that seemed to stretch across the miles between us. "I found more tracks, too," he finally said. 2 days ago. "Same boots from the look of them. Same size, right up against the back wall of the station underneath my window." "Did you report it? What is the point?" His voice was bitter in a way I had never heard from him before. "The day crew thinks we are both losing it. Too much time alone, they say. Too much quiet doing strange things to our minds. They will not do anything unless we have actual proof that something is wrong, and by then it might be too late. So what do? We stay alert. We keep our doors locked at all times. We do not go outside after dark, not for any reason." A pause waited with things unspoken. "And Marcus, if something happens to me, if you try to reach me on the radio and I do not answer, do not come looking. Just get out. Hike to the main road and get as far from these mountains as fast as you possibly can." "Danny, you are scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I have been doing some research in my off hours, talking to some people who worked these mountains before us old-timers who retired years ago. There have been disappearances here, Marcus. More than anyone wants to admit publicly. Rangers who went to check on something suspicious and never came back. Hikers who wandered off established trails and were never seen again. And before each disappearance, the same reports kept showing up. Strange lights in the forest at night, unexplained footprints, voices on the radio that should not have been there." The words landed like physical blows. "What are you saying?" "I am saying we are not the first ones this has happened to. Whatever is out there in these woods, it has been hunting here for a very long time, and I think it has decided to start hunting again." That night, Danny told me something that made everything infinitely worse. Before you came to Lookout 7, there was another ranger assigned to that tower, a guy named Henderson. He worked there for 3 summers in a row. Good man by all accounts, reliable, experienced, not the type to spook easily. What happened to him? He disappeared, August of '91, 3 years before you came to this particular tower. Danny's voice was heavy with the weight of what he was telling me. He made his evening report, same as always, said everything was fine. Next morning the day crew tried to reach him and got nothing but static. When they finally sent someone up to check, the tower was completely empty. Door wide open, coffee still warm on the stove, his logbook sitting open on the desk with a pen line across it like he had just stepped away for a moment. No sign of any struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. He was simply gone. My stomach dropped through the floor. Why did nobody tell me about this when I took the assignment? Because officially, according to the Forest Service records, it never happened. They classified it as voluntary departure, concluded that Henderson must have had some kind of mental break from the isolation and simply walked off into the forest. They buried the incident report because they did not want to scare off future employees or answer awkward questions from the press. Danny paused. I only found out because I went digging through old files after the boot prints started appearing near my station. I wanted to know if anything like this had ever happened before. And Henderson was not the first, not by a long shot. I found references to at least a dozen disappearances in this section of forest over the past 70 years. Rangers, hikers, hunters, researchers. Most of them were never reported in the news. The state has been keeping it quiet for decades because this is a major tourist area. Bad for business if people start thinking the forest itself is dangerous. I sat in the darkness of my cabin trying to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. A pattern of disappearances stretching back before I was born. A conspiracy of silence maintained across generations to protect tourism revenue. And now, whatever had been taking people from these mountains for decades was circling around me and Danny, testing our defenses, learning our patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What do we do? I asked again, though I already knew there was no good answer. We survive the summer, we stay inside after dark no matter what. We do not trust anything we see or hear out there. And we get the hell out of these mountains the absolute moment our contracts are up. His voice hardened into something sharp and urgent. And Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This is the most important thing I will ever tell you. I am listening. If I ever call you on the radio and tell you to go somewhere, if I tell you to leave your tower for any reason whatsoever, do not listen. Do not go, even if it sounds exactly like me. Even if it says all the right things, uses all the right words, do not trust it. What are you talking about? There are things in this world that can wear a person's voice the way you or I might wear a coat. Things that listen and learn, that study how we talk and think and feel, and then use that knowledge as a weapon against us. Some of the old-timers I talked to, the ones who have been working these mountains since before I was born, they told me stories. He paused. Stories about voices in the night. Voices that sound exactly like people you know, people you love, people you would trust with your life, calling you to come outside, calling you to follow them into the darkness. And if you are foolish enough to listen, if you're foolish enough to go... He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Danny, that sounds insane. Maybe. But 3 years ago, a ranger named Henderson walked out of his tower in the middle of the night and was never seen again. And the ranger who found his empty cabin the next morning told me one thing that did not fit with the official story. Henderson's radio log showed he had received a call about an hour before he vanished. A call that supposedly came from the ranger station, telling him to come down and help with an emergency. Supposedly. The station records from that night showed no outgoing transmission at that time. Nobody called Henderson. Nobody human, anyway. The words hung in the air between us, terrible and impossible, and somehow in that dark moment, entirely believable. Promise me, Marcus, promise me right now that if you hear my voice telling you to leave your tower at night, you will not listen. No matter how real it sounds, no matter how urgent. You stay where you are with the door locked until the sun comes up. I did not want to make that promise. Making it felt like admitting that everything Danny was telling me was true, that we were trapped in some nightmare that logic and reason could not explain. But I could hear the desperation in his voice, the bone-deep need for reassurance that his warning would be heeded. I promise. Good. He exhaled slowly. Try to get some sleep. I will be here all night, same as always. You are not alone out here, Marcus. Whatever else happens, remember that. But I was alone. We both were. Alone in our separate outposts, miles of dark forest stretching between us, listening for footsteps that came and went without explanation. Whatever comfort Danny's voice provided, it could not change the fundamental truth of our situation. If something came for us in the night, if something decided the time had finally come to add our names to the list of the vanished, no one would hear us scream. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the moon track across the sky, jumping at every shadow, flinching at every creak and groan of the old wooden tower settling around me. And when dawn finally came, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt not relief, but only a temporary reprieve. The night would come again. It always did. And somewhere out there in the darkness, something was waiting. The days blurred together after that, each one identical to the last, and yet somehow worse. I went through the motions of my job, mechanically recording weather data and scanning horizons and making radio reports in a voice that sounded increasingly hollow even to my own ears. The forest that I had loved for so many years now felt hostile alien, a vast green maze designed to confuse and trap and devour. Every shadow held a threat. Every silence was just the held breath before something terrible happened. The radio incidents became more frequent. 2 or 3 times a week now, I would wake in the small hours of the morning to that familiar crackle of static, and underneath it that slow, deliberate breathing. Sometimes there were whispers, 2 sounds that almost resolved into words before dissolving back into noise. I stopped trying to answer. I would just lie rigid in my cot, heart-pounding, hands clenched into fists at my sides, waiting for it to stop. Danny reported similar experiences, strange sounds on his radio at random hours of the night, voices that seemed familiar but subtly wrong, like recordings played at the wrong speed or spliced together from different conversations. Once he said he heard someone whispering his name over and over, so clear and close he was convinced someone was standing right outside his window. When he finally worked up the courage to look, there was no one there. Just empty darkness and the distant sound of wind in the trees. The lights started appearing around the same time. Small, flickering points of orange, like torches or lanterns, moving through the forest at odd hours when no one should have been there. They would appear in the distance, move for a while in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, almost ritualistic, then vanish as suddenly as they had materialized. I reported them to Danny. He checked with the day crew in the permit office. No one had authorization to be in our section of forest. No campers, no researchers, no maintenance teams, no one at all. They think we are imagining it, Danny said bitterly during one of our evening conversations, or making it up for attention. They are not going to lift a finger unless we have something concrete to show them. The footprints came back in the first week of August, and this time they came closer than ever before. I found them one morning circling my tower in the same wide arc as before, but now they climbed my stairs as well. I could see the marks where someone had stood on my small wooden porch right outside my door, inches from where I slept. The wood was scuffed and dirty where boots had rested, as if the visitor had stood there for a long time. Watching, waiting, deciding. I called Danny immediately. My voice was shaking badly enough that I had to repeat myself twice. "They came all the way to my door, Danny. They were standing right outside while I was sleeping inside." "Did they try to get in?" "I do not think so. The lock was still engaged when I woke up, but they were right there, right there." A long silence from the other end. When Danny finally spoke, his voice was hard with something I had never heard from him before. "Listen to me very carefully. I do not know what is happening in these mountains. I do not know who or what is out there, and I am not sure I want to know. But it is getting worse, Marcus. Getting bolder. Whatever is watching us, it is not afraid of us anymore. Maybe it never was. It is testing our boundaries, learning our weaknesses, waiting for us to make a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind Henderson made. The kind that ends with an empty cabin and a file that gets buried in the deepest drawer they can find." August 14th was our last normal conversation. We talked for hours that night, neither of us willing to sign off, both of us somehow sensing that we might not get another chance. Danny told me about his long-term plans, dreams of saving up enough money to buy some land somewhere far from everything, build a cabin with his own hands, live off the grid where no one could find him. He talked about his childhood in Oak Ridge, about fishing in the creek and hunting deer and all the small moments that had shaped him into the person he had become. He talked about loneliness and solitude and the difference between them, about finding peace in isolation rather than merely enduring it. "These past few months," he said at one point, his voice softer than I had ever heard it, "talking to you every night like this. It has been the best part of this entire miserable summer, maybe the best part of any summer I've spent working out here. I know we have never actually met in person, but I feel like I know you better than most people I have known my whole life. When this is all over," I said, "I want to meet you face to face, shake your hand, have a real conversation without static in the way. It is a deal. First round is on me. I am absolutely holding you to that." We said goodnight. The radio clicked off with its usual pop of static. I never spoke to Danny Mercer again. The real Danny Mercer anyway. August 15th, the day everything ended. I woke that morning with a sense of dread lodged in my chest like a physical weight, a heaviness that made it hard to draw full breaths. The sky was clear, the air warm, the forest as beautiful as it had ever been on any of the hundreds of mornings I had witnessed from this tower. Nothing was visibly different from any other summer day. But something felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. Something felt final, like the last page of a book about to turn. I went through my routine mechanically, forcing myself to focus on the familiar tasks, using the structure of my job as a barrier against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. Weather readings at the usual times, horizon scans every hour, radio checks with the day shift, all normal, all exactly as it should be. But underneath the normalcy, I was counting down the hours, waiting for sunset, waiting for the moment when Danny's voice would come through the radio and prove that everything was still okay, that we were still both alive, that the nightmare we had been living for the past few weeks had not yet reached its conclusion. At 9 o'clock, well after sunset had painted the sky in shades of red and orange and faded to purple and then to black, I sat down at my desk and called the ranger station. "Cascade, this is Lookout 7. Danny, are you there?" Static. Long, empty static that seemed to go on forever. "Danny, this is Marcus. Please respond." More static. I felt my pulse accelerating, felt sweat breaking out on my palms despite the cool evening air. Then finally a voice. "Lookout 7. This is Cascade. Sorry about the delay. Having some equipment issues tonight. You copy?" Relief flooded through me, so intense it was almost dizzying. It was Danny's voice. That familiar rough warmth I had come to know so well over the past 3 months. He was okay. Everything was okay. "Copy that, Cascade. You had me worried there for a minute." "Yeah, the radio's been acting up all day. Might need to have maintenance look at it." A pause. "How are you holding up?" "On edge." "Something feels different about tonight. I cannot explain it." "I know exactly what you mean. Too quiet out here. Even the insects have stopped making noise." I had not noticed until he pointed it out, but he was right. The forest beyond my windows was utterly silent in a way it had never been before. No crickets, no owls calling, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just emptiness, vast and complete, pressing against the glass like something trying to find a way in. We talked for a while after that, making observations about the weather and the stillness and the strange feeling that hung over everything. Danny sounded tired, but otherwise normal. I felt some of the tension in my shoulders start to ease. At 10 o'clock, I saw the fire. It appeared suddenly, a flicker of orange in the darkness about a quarter-mile to the northwest. My binoculars were on the desk beside me, and I grabbed them immediately, focusing on the distant glow. Through the magnification, I could see flames dancing between the trees. Not the flickering lights we had been seeing for weeks, but an actual fire. A campfire from the look of it. in a restricted zone, during the strictest burn ban of the summer. I grabbed my radio. Cascade, this is Lookout 7. I have a fire in the forest. Northwest of my position, approximately quarter-mile out, it appears to be a campfire. The response came immediately, no static at all. Copy that, Lookout 7. Can you identify the source? Negative. Too much tree cover to see who started it. A pause. Then Danny's voice again, but different somehow. Sharper, more urgent. Marcus, I need you to go down there and check it out. That fire is too close to your position. If it spreads in this dry weather, we could lose half the mountain before crews could get there. My blood turned to ice in my veins. His words from nights before echoed in my memory, as clear as if he were speaking them again. If I ever call you on the radio and tell you to go somewhere, do not listen. Do not go. Danny, I said slowly, carefully, you told me never to leave the tower after dark. You made me promise. I know what I said, but this is different. This is an actual fire during the worst possible conditions. The day crew is too far away to respond in time. You are the only one close enough to deal with this before it becomes a disaster. I stared out the window at the distant flames, my mind racing. The fire was real. I could see it with my own eyes, could smell the faintest hint of smoke on the air when the wind shifted. And Danny was right about the danger. These forests were bone dry in August. One uncontrolled fire could turn into a catastrophe that would take weeks to contain. But something was wrong. Something in his voice did not match up with my memory of how Danny sounded. It was too smooth, too confident, without the undertone of fear and exhaustion that had colored all our recent conversations. Danny, I am not comfortable leaving the tower. Can you call for backup instead? There is no time for backup. By the time anyone else gets here, the fire could have spread to 12 acres. You need to go now, Marcus. Right now. The urgency in his voice was compelling, persuasive. Every rational instinct told me he was right, that I had a duty to protect the forest, that refusing to act could result in devastation that would take decades to heal. But underneath those rational instincts, something older and deeper was screaming at me to stay where I was, to lock the door, to wait for sunrise. Okay, I said finally, against every instinct telling me not to. I will go check it out, but I am taking my radio and I want to stay in contact the entire time. Good. Check in every 5 minutes. If you miss a check-in, I will call for backup immediately. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, pulled on my boots with hands that trembled slightly, and headed for the door. My hand hesitated on the lock for a long moment. Do not trust my voice, Danny had said, even if it sounds exactly like me. But the fire was real. I could see it. I could smell it. Whatever was happening in these mountains, I could not just sit here and watch the forest burn. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the night. The walk to the fire took longer than it should have. The terrain was rough, strewn with rocks and fallen branches that seemed to materialize out of nowhere in the beam of my flashlight. The darkness pressed close around me, thick and heavy, and more than once I had to stop and listen because I could have sworn I heard footsteps paralleling my course through the trees. But whenever I froze and held my breath, there was nothing. Just silence and the distant crackle of flames I was walking toward. The glow grew brighter as I approached, flickering between the trunks, casting dancing shadows that looked almost like figures moving at the edge of vision. The smell of smoke grew stronger, harsh and acrid, cutting through the usual scent of pine and earth. Almost there. Just a little further. Then I could put out the fire and get back to safety. I pushed through a final barrier of undergrowth and stepped into a small clearing. The fire was there exactly where I had seen it from my tower. A large bonfire, flames leaping 4 or 5 feet into the air, crackling and snapping as they consumed a pile of branches and logs. But there was no one around it. No campers, no gear, no tents, no backpacks, no indication of who had built it or why. And around the fire, arranged in a careful circle on the ground, were stones. Large, flat stones, each about the size of a dinner plate, placed at precise intervals. On top of each stone, white objects gleamed in the firelight. I moved closer, my flashlight beam joining the flickering illumination of the flames, and saw what they were. Bones. Small bones, probably from rabbits or birds, arranged on each stone in spirals and patterns that looked almost like writing, like symbols in some language I had never seen before and could not begin to decode. This was not a campfire. This was something else entirely, something ritualistic, something ancient and deliberate and designed specifically to be seen from my tower, to draw me out of safety and into the darkness. I had walked into a trap. I grabbed my radio with hands that were shaking badly. "Danny, I am at the fire location. There's no one here, but there are stones arranged around it with bones on top. It looks like some kind of ritual site. I am coming back to the tower right now." Static. Just static, long and empty and cold. "Danny, do you copy?" More static. The signal was dead. I stood in that clearing, surrounded by fire and bones and the vast, indifferent darkness of the forest, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity what had happened. The fire was bait. The voice on the radio was not Danny. I had broken my promise, had walked right into exactly the kind of trap Danny had spent weeks warning me about. Something moved in the trees behind me. I did not wait to see what it was. I kicked dirt over the flames as fast as I could, smothering them in seconds, and then I ran. Back through the forest, back toward my tower branches, whipping at my face and roots grabbing at my ankles as if the forest itself was trying to hold me back. Behind me I heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Not one set, multiple sets coming from different directions, converging on my path. They were not trying to catch me. I realized that with a sick lurch of understanding. They were herding me, driving me in a specific direction like hunters driving prey toward waiting traps. I burst out of the tree line and sprinted across the clearing to my tower, taking the stairs 2 at a time, my lungs burning and my legs screaming. I slammed into my cabin door with all my weight. It was already open. The inside of my cabin had been destroyed. Everything I owned was scattered across the floor, torn apart, shredded, smashed. Books with their pages ripped out, clothes in tatters, food supplies dumped and crushed underfoot, and my radio, my only connection to the outside world, had been ripped from the desk and hurled against the wall with enough force to shatter it into a dozen pieces. Someone had been here while I was gone. Someone had ransacked my home and destroyed my lifeline while I was out chasing a fire that had been lit specifically to lure me away. The whole thing had been coordinated, planned, executed with precision. I could not stay here. The tower was no longer safe. My only hope was to get to the ranger station, to find Danny, to get help from someone who might have weapons and vehicles and the ability to call for backup. I grabbed what little I could salvage and ran back into the night. The 4-mile trail to the ranger station had never seemed so long. Every shadow was a potential threat. Every snapping branch sent my heart lurching into my throat. I moved as fast as I dared, flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the absolute darkness, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The footsteps followed me, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. Multiple sets moving through the forest on either side of my path, keeping pace, staying just beyond the reach of my light. They were herding me again, I realized, driving me toward the station like prey being funneled toward a waiting predator. But what choice did I have? I could not go back to the tower. I could not survive alone in the forest with no supplies and no way to call for help. The station was my only option, the only place that might offer some measure of safety. After what felt like hours, but might have been less than one, I saw lights ahead through the trees. The ranger station, its exterior lamps casting pools of yellow illumination across the dirt parking area. I felt a surge of hope so intense it was almost painful. Then I saw the front door, and the hope curdled into horror. The door was hanging open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. The windows behind it were completely dark, despite the exterior lights being on. And on the wooden porch, clearly visible in the spill of the lamps, were marks. Long parallel scratches gouged into the planks like something heavy had been dragged across them. "Danny!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and frightened in the vast silence. "Danny, are you in there?" No answer. Nothing but the creak of the door moving in the wind. I climbed the porch steps, stepping carefully around the drag marks, and pushed the door the rest of the way open. The interior was destroyed just like my cabin had been. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere like snow, the radio console ripped from the wall with wires hanging loose like severed veins, and on the floor of the back office, visible through the open doorway, blood. A lot of blood, more than a person could lose and still be alive. I followed the trail of blood and drag marks out the back door and into the tree line behind the station. They continued for about 50 yards, then simply stopped at the edge of a dense thicket. Near the end of the trail, half hidden in the underbrush, I found Danny's boots, both of them. One was still tied as if the foot that had been wearing it had simply been pulled free without undoing the laces. There was no other sign of him. No body, no clothing. Nothing but blood and boots and drag marks leading into darkness. Danny was gone. Something made a sound behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised like a weapon knife clutched in my other hand. A shape stood in the back doorway of the station, silhouetted against the dim light from inside. Human-shaped, human-sized, completely still. Marcus? The voice that came from the shape was Danny's voice, perfect, flawless, every nuance and inflection exactly as I remembered. "You came. I knew you would. You are not Danny." "No." The shape took a step forward, and I could see now that there was something wrong with the way it moved, something subtly off about the angles of its limbs. "Danny is not here anymore. Danny is part of the forest now." Another step, just like Henderson was, just like all the others were, just like you will be. I ran. Out the back, past the blood and the drag marks, into the darkness of the forest. I ran without direction, without plan, without anything except the desperate animal need to escape. Behind me, I heard pursuit. Not just the thing that had worn Danny's voice. Others. Multiple sets of footsteps crashing through the underbrush, coming from all sides, driving me deeper into the wilderness. I do not know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. There was only the next stride, the next breath, the burning in my lungs and the fire in my muscles. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. I fell twice, sprawling across rocks and roots, scrambling back to my feet before the sounds behind me could catch up. And then there were lights. Not the flickering orange of torches, but something steady and white and mechanical. Headlights, I realized. Car headlights on a road I had not known was there. I burst out of the trees just as a pickup truck came around a curve. I stood in the middle of the pavement, waving my arms, screaming words I cannot remember. The driver slammed on his brakes and stared at me through the windshield, eyes wide with shock at the bleeding, wild-eyed figure that had materialized from the darkness. "Please," I gasped when he rolled down his window. "Please, you have to help me. There is something in the forest. People are missing. Please." He looked at me for a long moment, taking in my torn clothing and bloody scratches and the raw terror on my face. Then he reached across and opened the passenger door. "Get in. I'm taking you to the police." As we drove away, I looked back at the tree line one final time. Just for a moment, in the red glow of the taillights, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Then we rounded a curve and the forest disappeared from view. The search for Danny Mercer lasted 2 weeks. Dogs were brought in trained trackers who had found lost hikers in conditions far worse than this. Helicopters swept the mountainsides in expanding grids, thermal cameras scanning for any sign of human heat. Hundreds of volunteers combed through the forest on foot, calling Danny's name until their voices went hoarse. They found things. The blood at the station was confirmed as human type A positive, matching Danny's personnel records. The drag marks were analyzed and photographed and documented in excruciating detail. Those ritual circles with their bone arrangements were found scattered throughout the forest, some old and weathered, others fresh enough to have been made within the past few weeks. Boot prints matching a common brand and size were tracked for miles in every direction, but they never led anywhere. They would simply stop sometimes in the middle of open ground as if whoever made them had suddenly ceased to exist. But they never found Danny. The case was officially classified as an abduction by unknown persons for unknown purposes. The investigation remained technically open for years afterward. Another file in a cabinet full of files about people who had vanished in these mountains without explanation. Detectives interviewed me multiple times, going over my story again and again, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. I could not blame them. I would have suspected me too. But eventually they had to accept that I was telling the truth, or at least some version of it. The evidence supported my account as far as the evidence went, and there was nothing to suggest I had any motive or opportunity to harm the man I had spent all summer talking to on the radio. I left Oregon after that summer. I could not stay. Every time I looked at the mountains, every time I smelled pine trees or heard static on a radio, the memories came flooding back with a force that left me gasping. I finished my degree through correspondence courses, packed everything I owned into my car, and drove east until I could not drive anymore. I built a new life far from any forest. Got a job at an accounting firm where the only wilderness was the maze of cubicles, and the closest thing to danger was a paper cut from filing documents. I got married to a woman who knew nothing about my past and did not ask questions about the nightmares that sometimes jolted me awake at 3 a.m. I had children and raised them and watched them grow up and move away. I became the kind of boring, ordinary person that nothing bad ever happens to. The kind who mows his lawn on Saturdays and watches football on Sundays and goes to bed at 10 o'clock every night with all the lights on because even after 30 years I cannot quite trust the darkness. But I never forgot. I never could. Danny's voice lived in my memory like a splinter buried too deep to extract, constantly present, constantly painful. The questions I could not answer replayed themselves endlessly. What had really happened that night? Who or what had taken Danny? Was he dead or something worse? Could I have saved him if I had been smarter, faster, more willing to listen to his warnings? 10 years ago, I started trying to find answers. I dug through archives and public records and old newspaper files. I tracked down retired rangers and aging witnesses and anyone else who might remember something useful. I compiled a file of my own, hundreds of pages of documentation about disappearances in the Cascade Range, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might explain what I had experienced. And in the ranger station logbook from August 15, 1994, buried among routine entries about weather conditions and supply inventories, I found something that changed everything I thought I understood. 1930. D. Mercer departed station for perimeter check. Expected return by 2100. I stared at those words for a long time, reading them over and over, trying to make them mean something other than what they clearly said. Danny had left the station at 7:30 that evening. 90 minutes before I first tried to contact him. More than 2 hours before the voice on the radio told me to go investigate the fire. If Danny left the station at 7:30 and never returned then, who had I been talking to all night? The answer was something I had been avoiding for 30 years. Something too terrible to face directly. Something had been monitoring our radio frequency for weeks, maybe months. Learning how Danny talked. Studying his patterns of speech, his vocabulary, his characteristic phrases, building a perfect replica of his voice, waiting for the right moment to use it. And I had fallen for the deception completely. Had trusted the voice without question because it sounded exactly like my friend. Had walked out of my safe tower and into the darkness because that voice told me to, even though the real Danny had spent weeks warning me that exactly this might happen. The thing that took Danny had tried to take me too. It had used his voice as bait the same way it had probably used other voices to lure other victims over the decades. The only reason I survived was luck. Pure blind luck, a stranger on a highway at exactly the right moment, a few minutes difference that meant everything. Danny was not so lucky. Danny walked out of the station at 7:30 to check on something, probably something he saw or heard that seemed to require investigation. And whatever was waiting for him in the forest took him before he could get back. I think about him constantly. My friend I never met. The voice that kept me sane through a summer of growing horror, that warned me again and again about dangers I did not want to believe were real. I think about his laugh and his stories and his dreams of building a cabin somewhere far from everyone. I think about the life he should have had and the death he probably suffered, and the fact that somewhere in those mountains, whatever is left of him might still be trapped in some form I cannot imagine. 2 months ago, I got a phone call that proved the nightmare is not over. A reporter from a newspaper in Eugene was working on a story about a recent disappearance in the Cascade Range. A young ranger named Tyler Bowen, 24 years old, had vanished from his station under circumstances that sounded hauntingly familiar. He had been working his first summer at a remote lookout tower. He had made his regular evening report and then gone silent. When the search team reached his station the next morning, they found the door open, the radio destroyed, and no sign of Tyler anywhere. The same section of forest, the same pattern of events. 30 years later. The reporter had found my name while researching historical disappearances in the area. She wanted to know if I would be willing to talk about what happened in 1994 to see if there were any connections that might help with the current investigation. I told her everything, all of it. The footprints and the lights and the breathing on the radio, the trap that lured me into the forest, the thing in the doorway that spoke with Danny's voice and smiled when I ran. I held nothing back because what was the point of secrets now? Whatever was happening in those mountains was still happening still, claiming victims still, using tricks and deceptions that had been perfected over decades of practice. The reporter listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told me something that confirmed my worst fears. In the days before Tyler Bowen disappeared, his colleagues at nearby stations had reported unusual activity. Strange lights moving through the forest at night, unexplained interference on the radio frequencies, the feeling of being watched by something that was never quite visible. And on the night Tyler vanished, the ranger who tried to reach him by radio heard something strange before the signal went dead. Tyler's voice calm and casual, saying he was going to step outside to check on a fire he had spotted through his window. A fire that the search teams never found any trace of. It is still out there. Whatever took Danny Mercer in 1994 is still hunting in those mountains, still using the same methods, still claiming victims who make the mistake of trusting familiar voices in the darkness. And no one is doing anything to stop it, because no one wants to believe it is real. No one wants to admit that there are things in the wilderness that human beings cannot explain or control. That is why I am telling this story now, not because I expect anyone to believe me, not because I think it will change anything, but because Danny Mercer deserves to be remembered as more than a name in a cold case file. Because the truth deserves to be spoken aloud even when it sounds like madness. Because somewhere out there right now, someone else might be sitting alone in a fire tower, hearing a voice on the radio that sounds exactly like a friend or a colleague or a loved one, not knowing that the person they think they are talking to might already be gone. If you are that person, if you work in the wilderness or hike through remote areas or ever find yourself alone in a place where no one can hear you scream, I need you to understand something important. The most dangerous thing in that forest is not bears or mountain lions or hypothermia or getting lost. The most dangerous thing is the voice that sounds familiar. The voice that knows your name, that uses phrases you recognize, that asks you to come outside and help with something urgent. The voice that belongs to someone you trust, because that voice might not be who you think it is. If you see a fire in the forest at night, do not investigate. If you hear someone calling your name from the darkness, do not answer. If a voice on the radio tells you to leave safety and go somewhere else, no matter how urgent the request sounds, No matter how perfectly it mimics someone you know, do not go. Stay inside, lock your doors, wait for sunrise. And whatever you do, whatever happens, do not answer when the forest calls your name. My name is Marcus Webb. Danny Mercer was my friend, and somewhere in the Cascade Range, in the darkness between the ancient trees, something is still waiting. Still listening, still learning new voices, still hungry. Rest easy, Danny, wherever you are. I have kept your memory alive for 30 years, and I will keep telling your story until the day I die. And maybe, just maybe, it will save someone else from the same fate that took you on that August night so long ago. Have you ever heard strange voices in the wilderness? Have you ever felt something watching you from the darkness between the trees? Have you ever received a phone call or a radio transmission from someone you trusted only to feel afterward that something was not quite right? If you have a story like that, tell it. Tell it to everyone who will listen. The only weapon we have against the things that live in the dark is the truth spoken loudly and often enough that people remember it when the time comes to save themselves. And the truth is this: there are places in this world where human beings do not belong. There are things in the shadows that are older and smarter and hungrier than we can possibly imagine. And sometimes the most dangerous sound you will ever hear is the voice of someone you love calling you to come home.